Numbers chapters 27 to 31 today with a bit of a sad start, because it opens up with God telling Moses that he's going to die soon. It's interesting that the language used is to refer to death is saying that Moses is going to be gathered to his people. And within this, it has the kicker that God reminds Moses that because back in the desert of Sin, when God told Moses to speak to a rock to obtain water and Moses whacked it instead, this is the reason why Moses is dying before he sees the promised land. I say it's sad. Actually, Moses seems pretty relaxed and groovy on this. His only concern seems to be about who's going to succeed him in leading the Israelites. The answer to which turns out to be Joshua, who, if you recall, was one of the goodies who went into the land of Canaan to pre-scout and then came back. It's a bit of a bitty section again, so we've got a couple of random extra bits to look at before we go on with some more genocide, inevitably. And there's just a whacking great section of all these boring sacrifices again. It seems to be sparked by the conversation about Moses' impending death. It's all very boring, and you're having to take your goat, turn it upside down, put a cabbage in its ear and all the rest of it. I'm going to skip over that. There is a brief mention of some festivals that need to be celebrated. So we've got the Passover being the commemoration of God saving the firstborn sons of all the Israelites during the Egyptian plague. The Festival of Weeks, the Festival of Trumpets, it's very loud. There's the big Festival of the Tabernacle, which lasts over a week. Oddly, the Festival of Weeks doesn't last a week. And there's the Day of Atonement, which we talked about before. Not going to dwell on any of those. It's too boring. I'm sure there is significant stuff in it, but no, not doing it. Chapter 30 is very short, and it's randomly about women's vows and how if a woman makes a vow, then she is held to it, unless her father or her husband say, no, that's not a thing, in which case she's released from it. It's weird, random, odd, and it sort of fits in with the Bible's treatment of women so far anyway, but that's another one. There's also another bit, and there's a chap called Zelophehad, who is dead, and he only leaves daughters, he doesn't have a son. And it seems that there's some sort of rule where the daughters cannot inherit his estate, so there's a question of where it goes. These ladies, the daughters, all go to Moses and say, well, this is crap, we should get the stuff. Moses agrees and goes to God and says, this is crap, they should get his stuff. God agrees, says, yep, this is crap, get his stuff. And so it all goes to them. So very short, bit random, would seem to suggest there's nothing intrinsically invalid about women in God's view or something. It's just that the preferential is to go to the man. I don't know. There's a can of worms open everywhere, but it seemed worthy of mention. Anyway, back to some genocide. So God says to Moses, go and wipe out the Midianites. It's not clear why particularly. But then once that's done, then he can get on and die. This gets very confusing about the distinction between Midianites and Moabites. But this all seems to be wrapped up with the idea of this God Baal guy and all the bad stuff that he's involved in. So I think that is why the Midianites are being killed. And clearly, I don't think all the Midianites are being killed, although the language is very, kill them all and all the rest of it. Moses' wife is a Midianite. So, although, to be fair, no one's seen or heard of her anything since the incident where she saved Moses' life with a very odd use of a rock back in Exodus. And apart from Aaron and Miriam had a whinge about her, which I think was actually because she was a Midianite, and they got themselves a plague for grumbling about it. So it seems there's nothing intrinsically wrong with Midianites. It would seem that there's some very total language being used to talk about it as a whole, because on the whole, in general, there's a lot of worship of Baal going on, because Baal is quite well documented, it turns out. There's a lot of sacrificing of children and stuff. It does seem on the whole that it's difficult to condemn a whole society, isn't it? But I think in that context of people saying, oh, we've got an Old Testament, he kills lots of people and there's lots of genocide, it's all unprovoked and all the rest of it, it does seem more like he's eradicating some really, really, really terrible behaviour. And you do wonder if the same people who talk about how terrible the God of the Old Testament was, also the ones who are complaining that all this suffering now that God does nothing about. It's well, hang on, you can't have it both ways. If he's stopping human sacrifice of children and women, all the rest of it. Yeah, there's a complicated question there, but there's a definite picture emerging, which I think I'll probably talk about more in the numbers summary. But yeah, not as straightforward as it seems, I don't think. Interestingly, Balaam, he of talking donkey fame, he was killed as part of this purge of the Midianites. I wasn't aware that he was a Midianite. I thought he was a Moabite, but there do seem to be a blurred distinction between the two. It's a bit odd that he's killed because he had the same God as the God of the Israelites, and he seemed to do as he was told. But then that angel was coming to kill him, it seemed, in that previous talking donkey story. So it would seem something is not quite right there, and sure enough, he's killed. So yeah, oh well, that's another mystery that we can't really quite solve. There's one interesting part is that Moses gets grumpy with the generals, as it were, because it turns out that they've been sparing the women. And he's like, why have you been sparing the women? There's a useful part in this because it then gives Moses the opportunity to explain a bit more about what they're doing, and sure enough confirms that this is all about this ball guy, and that's why they're killing this society. I don't quite know what these women are supposed to have done specifically, but that's going to be a recurring theme. We'll be dealing with fragmented information from thousands of years ago. So Moses says, right, go back, do the job properly, kill everybody, except, of course, the virgin girls. You can keep those for yourselves. There's no age thing specified here. I don't know. I think there's a lot of problems with a lot of this stuff. That all gets done anyway, and then they divide the plunder, which involved a lot of donkeys. Not mentioned if any of them were the talking donkey, or whether it's no longer a talking donkey and is now just a plain old donkey. Given that God said that Moses was going to die after this was done, I sort of thought he was then going to drop dead, but reading ahead a little bit, he's still in it for a little bit. So, a bit odd, not quite sure what's going on there, but it seems his days are certainly numbered. I just want to briefly go back to this bit about the description of dying being gathered to your people. There's been several references to this already. For example, Jacob / Israel, his death was described as being gathered to his people. A lot of what happened in Genesis, though, was people died and their bodies did actually return to their homes, so it seemed like a physical thing. But Moses can't be taken home because he's in a wilderness and he's sort of from Egypt, but sort of not from Egypt. And therefore, it'd be difficult to describe this as being a physical thing for his body. So it suddenly made me think, this does sound like it might be alluding to some sort of thing taking place after life. It's tricky because nothing has actually been stated in terms of there being anything after we die. But this does seem to hint at that. But it's odd that would be a thing, but then it's not mentioned. I don't know. But it's also, I guess, true that, for example, in Jacob / Israel's case, it was the book describing it as that. It's not saying God has said this to Jacob. In the Moses context, it is actually God saying to Moses, you will be gathered to your people. So it's actually a statement from God saying about what is going to happen. So it's interesting, but I don't know if that is the idea of an afterlife starting to creep in. We'll have to keep an eye on it. Anyway, I think we've only got one more video in Book of Numbers before we do the summary. But we'll go on with that one then next and see where we go.